back, ladies and gentlemen, to Battle Hardened, America's Backbone. I am your host, Samuel Markley, joined again by my co-host, Avery Davis. He is a ETSU graduate and military historian. If you weren't with us, or if you were with us, just to give a little recap, last episode we covered the Doolittle Raid, the secret mission that was in retaliation of Pearl Harbor, a huge morale booster for the American spirit going into World War II. And today, what we'll be going into is the polar bear expedition. Last week we did one, or 2 weeks ago we did one that was top secret, and this one's kind of just a forgotten um, little mission that the American Army went on. Um, so the time period we're going to be looking at today is from about September of 1918 to around July of 1919. So you have almost a year, not quite a year. Um, but if you do know, 1918 and the time period a little bit before that, you have World War One that was going on, and a good point to make going into the polar bear expedition is that Russia had to exit the war during due to internal conflicts. As we know, the Russian Revolution started up. You have the Bolsheviks versus the anti-Bolsheviks. This is where Russia started to lean communist, and the Communist Party really took a stand during the Russian Revolution. Um, so going into it, you have Britain and France, who was our allies, they were anti-revolution for Russia. They were on the side of the anti-Bolsheviks, anti-communist. So you have them wanting to start an allied intervention in Russia in order to kind of keep the Bolsheviks out of power. Um, and so you're going to see that they directly request Woodrow Wilson for the United States to join in on this intervention. At first, Wilson was very hesitant towards it, didn't really want to get involved, didn't really see the American benefit for it. As you know, America really didn't want to get involved too much with World War One, but they did. So he really didn't want to get involved. But like Woodrow Wilson, like we know him to do, um, you ask and you ask again with the guy, and he'll give in for you. So eventually, after just requesting and requesting and requesting from Britain and France, you see that Woodrow Wilson gives in and puts the United States in a position to join the intervention. So Avery, if you want to add anything.
Yeah, it's really interesting there because I guess directly on that point, Wilson actually supported war more than Congress did, I believe, despite not really feeling the U.S. need to intervene. Um, he was kind of like, well, I mean, like, we could do this. And the people wanted nothing to do with it. And then he was kind of cold on it. But then the Lusitania happens. And that's kind of one of those things that starts to get people fired up a little bit. And then you got the Zimmerman telegram where Germany is like, hey, Mexico, if you want to invade in the South, we'll, split America with you or something.
Yeah.
And that gets people really fired up. Even today, when you start talking Mexico doing something, it really gets people divided on a topic. So you've got that. Russia exiting World War One early on. You got to remember in 1905 or 7, the Tsar had already put down one rebellion. So the monarchy was seen as weak because there was so much retaliation against the government already. They're seen as vulnerable. And at this point, Russia had the highest casualties of the war so far. They had food shortages that sparked riots on the home front in the capital of St. Petersburg. There will be women that start rioting out in the streets because there is like no bread, and it just spreads into other major cities in Russia. Nicholas is advised to step down by the Russian parliament that I don't remember the name of right now, but a temporary government of soldiers and workers will take over, and they are actually what will become known as Soviets, this party of workers and soldiers.
All right. So going into the main goals of this intervention that Britain and France had, let's say, masterminded together. We'll get into why it kind of really wasn't masterminded together. But here were the goals. They had good intentions for it. They wanted to prevent Allied war material to fall to the Bolsheviks and Germans. And you got to realize that before Russia left, they were on the Allied side. They were helping Britain, France, and everybody on the Allied side. So you had Allied equipment that was already stationed in Russia, and so you're supporting the anti-Bolsheviks. So you don't want that equipment you already had stationed there to fall to um, the Bolsheviks who you're against, but you also don't want to let it fall to the Germans who you're fighting a war against. So either way, if your materials would have gone to either side, the Bolsheviks or Germans, I mean, it was going to be bad for you regardless of who got their hands on it. You just wanted to make sure you could protect that. And then the other main goal was to rescue the Czechoslovak Legion. This is a strong anti-Bolshevik force. They were actually stuck in Russia. They were a strong Allied effort, and they had very valuable troops to the Allied effort. So uh, the Allies really wanted to make sure that when they did this intervention, and they really made an effort to get out and to protect and rescue these very key components to their strategy, both in the war and for the intervention.
Yeah, there's a lot, with the goals going on there. One of the things you got to remember at this point, you're looking at July 1918. When Wilson sent troops into Russia in July 1918, World War One was not still a slam dunk victory. We know that in November is when the armistice will happen, but with the Russian Empire no longer in the mix, Germany had moved all their divisions to the French side to try and push in these final blows to the war. And in the spring 1918 German offensive, they had finally moved within artillery range of Paris. And if they would have captured Paris, it'd probably be game over. Allies be pushed back, to the coast. Not really much you can do there. So in northern Russia and eastern Russia in July, and that was going to be that 13,000 troops. They did this in the hope that the Russians would rejoin the war if they defeated the Reds. They hoped that the Whites would win so that they could reopen that eastern front and take pressure off of France. That way, they would not just run through and capture Paris.
Right. So, getting more into going actually into the polar bear expedition. Or are you going to say something else?
Yeah, I got one more small thing, real quick.
I got you.
In 1917, this had already been considered as an option, deploying troops to Russia. There were supplies in Archangel and Murmansk, and the Allies realized that they might be able to utilize ports in the Arctic Circle and save supplies while providing rallying points for the Czechs, who were still cut off a year ago at this point. If they were able to take some of those ports in the Arctic Circle, they would deter German submarine bases there. But this plan just kind of fell through as the U.S. just joined and there was a lot of fighting going on. There wasn't really the capability yet and the trust in command to open a front up in the Arctic Circle. And it's very hard to do that with the atmosphere there,
Yeah.
climate.
All right. So, getting more
Sorry.
into, no, you're good. Getting more into the intervention. So after Wilson agreed, he only agreed to limited help with the intervention effort. It wasn't going to be like America, like full blown joined in on it, sent everybody they could over there to help. It was going to be a limited effort. So his plan was that the 85th Division, who was actually going and preparing to go to the Western Front to help with World War One, he gave General Pershing, he gave him the news, and the general and Wilson combined assigned that the 339th Infantry Regiment, 1st Battalion of the 310th Engineers, and a few other smaller units out of the 85th would switch up from the Western Front and would work to get to Russia to help with the intervention effort. I'm really stumbling over my words today. So once they still went to England, that's where they landed at first. Um, and there they received training with Russian equipment. Because you got to think, fighting in Russia and fighting in the Western Front was two totally different atmospheres. You got two totally different terrains, different styles of warfare, way different conditions. So, they had to receive some sort of training because they weren't just going to be able to go over there with their like Western Front mind and be able to succeed in Russia. So after their training with Russian equipment, they were eventually sent to northern Russia, and they arrived in Archangel on September 4th, 1918.
Yeah. So when you talk about the training going into this, the 339th Regiment was chosen because they were from Michigan, and military commanders figured they could handle this different war zone's extreme cold. They were building like wooden barracks in Michigan in the snow. I think there's some photographs of that. And then when they get to England, they actually received training from Antarctic explorer Ernest Shackleton, who made three Antarctic expeditions on how to survive below zero conditions. So they were really trying to get a lot of training in for this. But when they get done with that training, they didn't stay in Archangel very long once they landed. The British were very ambitious, and their first goal was to reach the city of Kotlas, a railroad crossing where they hoped to connect with the Czechoslovak Legion immediately. So they were deployed in like long arcs of up to 200 miles in South Archangel along the Davina and Vega rivers, which I know we'll get more into the theaters. But there was, I mean, they hit the ground running. They get there and they think, okay, maybe we've got a little bit to acclimate. We're going to be building some barracks and stuff. No, the British, they take command. They're like, all right, we got to get here now.
Yeah, exactly. So, like you were saying, going more into the actual expedition itself, um, the British have already been there since early August, or even earlier than that. So they had already been planning, figuring things out, getting strategies together, and they had actually got word that Allied equipment had been moved around with the Bolsheviks, and so they needed to get involved and get involved fast. So the British were already there, working everything out. So, I mean, as soon as the U.S. got there, like you said, they hit the ground running. There was no really welcome party. It was more, all right, you're here, get to work. They were immediately involved with the offensive strategies that the British had planned out and everything. They were already starting to get used into those key factors of this expedition. So the first task they really had, or the expedition really had, was to focus on rescuing that Czechoslovak legion. Uh, so again, another, like I said earlier, very important that you rescue those valuable, loyal Allied effort for just the sake of the war and the intervention. So you have where the British mostly controlled each procedure that would be going on during this expedition. Like I said earlier, again, America was a limited effort. They really didn't want to get too involved. They were kind of just there because honestly, they felt like they had to. Britain and France were their allies. Um, and so you go into it, and again, this wasn't a super long expedition. It wasn't even a year in length, but you did have the Allies push back the Bolsheviks for about 6 weeks, which was a pretty good. I say a pretty good feat because, I mean, we're going to get into more in depth stuff about this expedition later. But they pushed them back for about 6 weeks. And then next we'll go into the two fronts, or Avery, if you wanted to add anything onto that.
Yeah, I wanted to add something I kind of had failed to mention earlier when we were talking about training and stuff. Um, you got to think in World War One, the main like equipment, specifically firearms used by Britain and America, are the number one Mark III Lee Enfield, the Pattern 14 rifle, the Pattern 17 rifle, and the Springfield '03. Those are kind of the four main battle rifles used by like the U.S. and Britain. When they get over there, the U.S. supplies that were already there are not U.S. rifles. They are the Mosin Nagant rifle, the M91, made by Remington and New England Westinghouse, which was like an appliance brand, I believe. And so they get over there, and it's like, oh yeah, by the way, we're training you on Russian weapons because that's the ammo you're going to find. Like we don't know what we're going to get into ammo supply wise, but everything that we had already manufactured was Russian caliber stuff. So they have to retrain a whole manual of arms on these. And if you're familiar with the Mosin platform, um, it was way longer than the US and British standard service rifles, and the stripper clips are historically and notoriously bad to use because it's not just a push down on there. It's kind of hard to get used to because the British number one rifle held 10 rounds, the pattern 14 and 17 rifles held 6 rounds, and the M91 Mosin held 5 rounds. So you are cutting down your capacity when you're fighting. So that was really kind of awkward to get used to.
Yeah, definitely. Again, just the change of everything from what America was really used to fighting with, and getting sent into Russia. Like you mentioned, all the weapons. America was so used and accustomed to the 30-06 that moving into the Mosin was shot. I believe it's 7.62 by 54. I may be wrong on that, but I believe that's what it shot. So you're having two different styles of ammo you're going to have to get used to, and everything totally different from what they were used to training with and everything in the States. So moving on into
Well, and you've
the
got when you get into like that ammo debate, you've got also the British were a little bit more familiar with this, but not as much the Americans. Rimlock 7.62 by 54 is a rimmed cartridge. It has like a little like extra brass rim. 30-06 was not. So you could easily have like different kind of ammo jams and stuff because that little lip kind of sticks out and attaches to other rounds.
yeah, a ton of factors going into it. If you get down to the nitty gritty, you can talk about all the differences for a very long time and still have more to talk about. So moving on into the two fronts, you have the Dvina River and the Vologda Railroad. So first, let's talk about the river front. This was the most influenced front by American troops. This is where anti-Bolsheviks were pushing inland to secure the river route. Um, you're going to see a big factor of this expedition as like the two fronts are named the river and the railroad. You have big rivers and railroads are very big for transportation of both humans, goods, services, everything. So those are two kind of things that you really want to lock down and make sure that you have access to before your enemy has access to it, because it's such a big factor in an expedition or war or anything. You're going to want to make sure that you have that. So if you might be asking, like, what was fighting here like? Because you're going to deal with totally different, even with between the two fronts, you're going to have different environments and everything. So if you're focusing on the river front, you're going to have things like river patrols, small skirmishes, and you're going to have like a very different style of warfare that's dealt with like frozen and forested terrain. Um, so you're going to be dealing with rivers, forests, villages, and at the same time, you're going to be facing these harsh Russian conditions, very cold, very, you got snow and all of that, very different than what they were planning to go to and fight for the Western Front.
Yeah, and there's a couple other if you don't care if I mention, there's some other small fronts that I just wanted to like throw out as these were there, but they're not as prevalent
Mentioned.
as the ones you mentioned. One other location is Pinega. There was little fighting, couple garrisons there, not really a major location. The Vega River was probably the third most mentioned field. It was the most advanced position in the Polar Bear Expeditionary Force. the Bolsheviks would win a lot of battles there and push the American Expeditionary Force, which is the U.S. Army, back to Shinkurst as a retreat. That was a major Allied defeat. The Imsa River area was a route of communication between two major operating lines in the Dvina River and Vologda, Railroad. So that was a kind of major thing there because it connected those two. And then in Onega, March 1919 will be the Battle of Bolshy Ozerki, and that was the last major battle.
Yeah. So if you're looking at the other major front, like I mentioned, the Volga Railroad. So again, your railroad was a very critical supply route. So you're looking to control it, and it stretched across South and Central Russia. So you're looking at a big area. I mean, we know Russia's huge. So connecting South and Central, this is a very critical rail supply route within Russia and for this intervention effort. So here you're going to have Americans that are tasked with defending rail stations, bridges, and we're fighting in very harsh winter conditions. So if you're looking at more of the terrain here, you're going to be fighting with railroads, stations, bridges, and all of which is going to be snow covered. Again, very harsh winter conditions because I mean, they got here in what did we say, September. So that's already getting into the fall, which is already going to start getting harsh in Russia. And moving on into the winter, it's not going to be a good time. As we know throughout history, whenever anybody tries to do anything with Russia, the weather and everything, especially in the winter, will always give the enemy a disadvantage because they're just not. They're not. I don't want to say they're not ready for it, but they're not conditioned for it, I think is a better way to put it. So if you want to add anything.
Yeah, I just kind of, hey, everybody should have learned from Napoleon. You don't defeat General Winter very easily. Top tier guy right there, General Winter. When the U.S. gets there, I talked about earlier in the show how they didn't stay in Archangel to guard Allied arms caches. They're deployed in long, like sweeping arcs, 200 miles south of Archangel. And it's really an overextended deployment. Like the Allied troops are spread out just way too far to be effective. So Leon Trotsky and the Bolshevik army grew in strength because there wasn't really a whole lot of need to attack Allied forces because they weren't grouping up in mass forces. So there was a lot of frequent face-to-face combat after that in this formation. And even in November 11th, 1918, which is Armistice Day, there were Americans, Canadians, and Scottish troops fighting in bloody battles with the Bolshevik forces all day. So it's just like they were just isolated. And I think, I can't remember his first name, but Nelson, he wrote a book on, it's called The Polar Bear Expedition. He has a quote that I have from there that says, they kept these guys in isolated, naked positions well into 1919. The biggest complaint you heard from the soldiers was no one can tell us why we're here, especially after the armistice. So they're in these just big, drawn out formations, and that's just a morale killer. Like, there's not very many people around you. You don't really like have a lot to do besides just get your butt kicked while you're up there. So it gets really hard to fight in this expedition with the waning amount of support and many of those soldiers, questioning like, well, we've been here for a few months. World War One is over, so we know that we're not fighting like German operatives or anything. Why are we here? And so that's a like morale question that's going to plague the rest of this expedition.
Yeah, exactly. Like you said, both fronts became super long and spread out. So that alone made it a very hard effort to communicate and fight. But like you said, super low morale. The U.S. really didn't want to be involved at all, and you had like very unclear planning and goals of what was truly going on or how to effectively go about it. And you also, again, had the factor of harsh conditions. The winter will always be a factor. The weather will always be a factor there. Um, but going into like the low morale, uh, our troops really didn't want to be there or anything. They were kind of just there. The U.S. had no true reason to be involved with it. You're kind of also looking into like kind of like the Vietnam War. If you want to compare the two, you're looking at there was like the U.S. was involved for honestly like you can look at it and bring about reasons that we were involved, but like the troops had no morale, no want to be there. It wasn't a thing that the U.S. was directly involved in, or you can say threatened by communism and all that, but I mean, if you're looking at it, it really wasn't necessarily the best time to fight for it because the U.S. was not directly getting threatened by it at the time. So there was really no need to be over there. So going into the winter, the Allies weren't able to stay on the offensive like they had been during this expedition. So, due to the difficulty to communicate, difficulty to supply, maintain ground, etc., there were a bunch of different factors. And they became very self-aware about it too. So they chose to switch and try to start operating defensively because that was the only way that they were going to be able to stay there and still try to get something done. And at this time, you also have the anti-Bolshevik volunteers starting to be very sparse. You're not having as many of them anymore as you did at the beginning. You're going to see the Bolsheviks are clearly starting to take the rise of control here. They also, and it's very interesting because you're going from the main goal of linking up with the Czech Legion and getting that kind of thing, but at this point, they kind of had to give up on their goal of that and just work at fighting towards the Bolsheviks, but also staying on the defensive. And having two fronts and having two goals at the same time was becoming almost, or if you want to say impossible, it was just becoming something that they really weren't going to be able to carry out effectively, working on two fronts with two goals.
Yeah, you've got two fronts right here in this operation. General William Graves was the U.S. commander in Siberia, and he was not a big fan of this from the get go. He tried really hard to keep his men out of it, and he met with this U.S. Secretary of War, Newton Baker, to hand him Wilson's memo about the mission. And so there was just a lot of disagreement in the leadership there. Um, Graves and the AEF Siberia, which was the American Expeditionary Force in Siberia, they landed in Vladivostok, and there was like Graves wrote there was no information about the military, political, social, economic, or financial situation in Russia. They went in blind. They started in the Czech controlled area, which was most of Siberia, and that was like the Trans Siberian Railway. Graves had to deploy his troops just to kind of guard the railway and the coal mines on that southern front. And that was like the lifeline for the Czechs and White Russians who were fighting the Red Army. But Russia, the way that their politics were so quickly shifting up to November like 1918, the White Russian admiral Alexander Kolchak overthrew the provisional government in Siberia that the Czechs supported, and World War One was over, and the Czechs withdraw. In October, the Northern AEF force had abandoned their goal to join up with the Czechoslovak region, so they really pull out of that pretty early, and that goal just kind of goes down the drain. So with that goal gone, it's like, what are we really fighting for? But they were. It was just kind of like the U.S. was trying to intervene. without directly intervening in another nation's politics. And that's kind of one of the U.S. goals for warfare and counterterrorism. Even going this far back and even into Spain and stuff, we have a history of getting involved to keep the governments that we want in power. And that's just a goal from the executive branch. Like, we are trying to defend democracy. And at this point, there's just a lot of home front politicians in the U.S. who don't even know what we're doing. Senator Hiram Johnson, a progressive Republican from California, spoke in 1918 and said, in December of 1918, and said, "What is the policy of our nation toward Russia? I do not know our policy, and I know no other man who knows our policy." Johnson was reluctant for the U.S. to get into World War One, but he quickly builds opposition to these Russian missions, and that waning support just continues to decrease.
Yeah, so if you're gonna, look at this all in total, going towards the end of the expedition, um, you're gonna have where the Bolsheviks basically just took over. They hit the river, they hit the Vago River, like you mentioned, part of the Dvina front. They inflicted huge casualties and caused the Allies to retreat, which was kind of just the Allies were already starting to fall, and this was pretty much the end of it. So if you're looking at northern Russia in total, you're going to see that America had around 210 or more casualties. You're looking at around 110 deaths in battle, around 30 missing in action, and then around 70 died from disease, which was 90% the flu. And a little interesting note is the Spanish flu. We know it was a huge factor in World War One and in the whole world at this time. This kind of thing hit the world, and it just wreaked havoc. Basically, I mean, you have soldiers dying in warfare, but you're also having them die due to the flu. Um, and it's huge amounts of soldiers dying from the flu too. It's not just like a couple of them got sick and ended up dying. It would get to a regiment and then it would just wreak havoc and spread throughout a bunch of different people. And they really didn't have the modern medicine we do today or anything, especially out in the field. So it was just a very huge factor, and a devastating one at that, to the world at this time. And so I mentioned the casualties around 210. There are reports after the fact. I think one came out in like October of 1919, that actually put the casualties at 553. There are a couple other reports that have it around that number. So these would go more for 109 killed in battle, 335, sorry, not 300, 35 died of wounds, 81 from disease, 19 from random accidents or other causes, 305 wounded, and then there were around four prisoner of wars that were released that they knew of.
Yeah, there was it was it took a toll on American forces even as short as they were there. And I know as we kind of get towards the Spanish flu in that 1919 report, kind of wrapping up the expedition, in January 1919, the Bolsheviks launched an offensive between the Dvina River and the railroad, which forced the evacuation of Ust-Padenga, Shinkursk, and Shigoveri. I know I talked about Shinkursk there in the beginning. It was one of those most advanced positions. The Allies established a new line defense after retreating, and they garrison that, and it becomes more widely dispersed than when they even got there. In March, there was some severe fighting around Bolshiozerki, and on May 1st, there was just a big threatening attack near the Vega River, and it was beaten off. But there's so many at this point. They've started evacuating, which I know we're going to talk about. In April 1919, the American 167th and 168th Railroad Transportation Companies joined the expedition, operating in the Murmansk region. And I think they were one of the last groups to come over. They performed some service and helped with transportation and then they returned to France 3 months later. Um, I don't want to steal your thunder with the withdrawal, but Johnson, like I had mentioned earlier, Hiram Johnson, in February, he challenges the U.S. deployment in North Russia, and they're going to fail by one vote in the Senate. And Vice President Thomas Marshall is going to be the tiebreaker. And a few days later, the Secretary of War Baker that I talked about, he announced that the polar bears would sail home at the earliest possible moment that weather and spring will permit, because it was going to be hard to get out with the White Sea frozen over. But when you look at like all those casualties that you talked about going into this, it was said by Lieutenant John Cadet, I think that's how you say his name, that after their 9 month campaign had cost them 235 men, he said, when the last battalion set sail from Archangel, not a soldier knew, not even vaguely, why he had fought for or why he was going now, and why his comrades were left behind, so many of them beneath wooden crosses. So the casualties were just hard to watch. It was just it was a bloody campaign. It was a harsh campaign for no gain.
So going more into the withdrawal, like you had already mentioned, so you had armistice, which was already signed a while ago at this point. So you really had no morale. Harsh conditions were still hitting hard. No plans, missions, goals that were solid left. America had no reason to be involved, kind of like I said earlier with Vietnam. Spring 1919 begins the actual withdrawal process. So you have from June and July of 1919 is the final evac, and that officially withdrew all Americans that were left in Russia at this time. So going in to the aftermath and legacy of the polar bear expedition, um, you're going to see that public pressure kind of is one of the largest factors that brought them home. Um, and again, I'm comparing it a lot to the Vietnam War. Um, they had a little recognition when they got home, and they were kind of brought home with a cold shoulder towards them. There was a very strong bitterness amongst veterans towards the government and everything. They, but if you look into the point of view of the veterans, like you had already kind of mentioned with one of your quotes you used, they felt like they were blindly put into a war they had no business being in. They didn't know what they were doing it for, truly where they were going, or what the result was going to be. Um, and they really, like, kind of after learning what it was about, they were like, well, we had no business doing that. Like, what was the point? And so, really, from the get go, they realized, or they didn't really realize much, but they knew that what they were doing really wasn't something that needed to be done. You had kind of a suspicious look on it from the beginning, from the get go. And you also see that the government shut down a lot of info about the expedition. They really didn't want this to be that known of a topic. Um, Again, going into it as you can see it as like it has the forgotten war status. I personally had no clue about this until Avery mentioned it to me. Looking into it got super interesting and everything. It's crazy what you can learn, and what brings light to things like these when you actually start learning about them and looking into them. Um, so. You're going in. There's some memorials for the polar bear expedition. You have the Polar Bear Memorial Association, which was a veteran-formed organization to honor the fallen soldiers during this time and ensure that history isn't forgotten. So, I mean, there is information out there about it. It's not totally forgotten, but unless you do that digging and looking for it, it's not something you're just going to learn in a classroom, most likely. Um, And if you're going to look into other memorials, the Whitechapel Cemetery, located in Detroit, Michigan, like you mentioned, a lot of these soldiers that were on this expedition in the polar bear unit were out of Michigan. There's 56 Americans that were recovered from Russia that are buried there. There's also the Polar Bear Memorial, which I saw pictures of. Looks pretty cool. You can see the polar bear statue with I believe it's with a cross and a army helmet, a cool statue there as a memorial for the polar bear expedition. You're also looking at annual remembrances. Ceremonies often take place at that Whitechapel, especially around times of like Memorial Day and everything like that. There are ceremonies that take place there. Going into more of the Forgotten War status. Again, it was kind of a forgotten chapter of U.S. history, and I mean, it's not for a, I mean, you always want to have the knowledge of what happened in your past, but it's not necessarily a bad thing that it was forgotten. It's definitely not a good thing, but I mean, it was something that was kind of a flaw on the government side, but the government also likes to hide a lot of what they do wrong. Uh, I may have just got canceled, but it's all right. But you're looking at it was kind of a government flaw, so they wanted to hide it up. That's why you really don't learn much about it. And you're also seeing that this brought about criticism of the U.S. policy. Like you mentioned, the United States likes to go and help protect democracy wherever they can. But if you look at it, it kind of just prolonged the Russian Civil War, made it worse than it already was. It hurt relations from the beginning between the United States and Russia. I mean, you're going in later down the road into the Cold War, so you're already going to have those hostile relations between the two. Even in World War II, you're going to have those hostile relations that really come about. And you really there was no strategy or thought truly, if you look into it, about this. You're also going to see distrust, as I mentioned. There were early effects on the Cold War that were starting, and it started up very questionable. Like, people became very questionable of these government decisions, like sending our troops over to fight something that wasn't our war. I mean, you're putting them in a position where they truly know nothing, and it's kind of for nothing if you want to say that at the same time. And then the last little thing I had was about Michigan. The history of the expedition is mainly preserved in Michigan because it was that's where most of the troops came out of. And then Avery, if you wanted to add anything on to all that.
Yeah, I kind of want to just one small addition to there. We talked about these troops being pulled out by May of 1919. The Siberian troops did not leave until January of 1920. Um, that was when the Wilson administration ordered those troops out. And they cited unstable civil authority and frequent local military interference with the Trans Siberian Railway. He lost an additional 189 men on top of the polar bears up north. So there's just a forgotten aspect, like those guys as well. Um, it kind of starts to look like the Middle East out there. The Russians are torturing and executing people and harassing U.S. forces. That's kind of what we see later on in the Middle East when we fight there. It's just harassment and torturing and stuff. For the listeners that were interested in this topic and like the World War One kind of subject, there's a good friend of mine. His name's Storm, and he is working on a film project called To Hell and Back. It's going to be one of the biggest like World War One research films done recently. He's got he's got the 1,600 hours of World War One footage, and he wants to put it together into a 90 to 100-minute documentary. So if you are interested in maybe some of this like Russian stuff or any of the other countries we talked about today during this time of World War One, I highly encourage you go check his stuff out. It's the Hell and Back Film Project on Instagram, and you can just look up some kind of stuff on there that he's got. He posts a lot of these films, and they're just really good things.
Well, that's pretty cool. I definitely recommend y'all go check that out. I'll check it out for sure. So just to wrap everything up we've said today, my very last bullet point I had down on my notes was another comparison to Vietnam. It's just a good question to bring up. Casualties for no reason. Was this kind of like Vietnam before Vietnam truly happened? And that's a good question to end everything on. I believe that can spark a lot of thinking. I know it did in my mind. I was thinking about it a lot while I was writing down everything, preparing for this episode. But I believe that is everything for today. I appreciate everyone for listening. I appreciate you, Avery. Thank you for joining me once again. Um, Sorry that it took us a little bit to get this one up. We had a lot of technical difficulties that hit us this week like preparation for this episode. But thank y'all for viewing another episode. I hope y'all learned a lot. I know I did. And thanks everybody just once again, and I'll see you in the next episode.